She noticed the mug before she noticed herself. This story is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. The kitchen was still half asleep, that quiet American hour between dawn and the rest of the world. Pale light slipped through the blinds, landing softly on the counter where the coffee maker hummed its familiar tune. Linda stood there in her socks, one hand wrapped around a ceramic mug she'd owned for years, the other resting on the edge of the sink as if steadying herself. Nothing dramatic had happened. No burst of energy. No lightning bolt of realization. Just a small, almost imperceptible feeling that this morning was different. At 68, Linda had learned not to trust big promises. She'd lived through decades of headlines that shouted about miracle solutions, overnight answers, and secrets they don't want you to know. Over time, she'd grown careful, even a little guarded. Her life now was built on routines she understood. Waking early, feeding the cat, brewing coffee strong enough to taste but not so strong it made her jittery. Predictability had become a kind of comfort. Yet, as she stood there, steam curling up toward her face, she noticed she wasn't rushing. Her shoulders weren't hunched the way they often were in the morning. Her mind, usually already rehearsing the day's errands and obligations, felt quieter, like a radio turned just slightly down. She took a sip. The coffee tasted like coffee. Warm. Familiar. Maybe a touch richer, though she couldn't say for sure. Linda wasn't someone who romanticized small changes. She had raised kids, buried loved ones, navigated layoffs and illnesses. She knew the difference between wishful thinking and real life. Still, she paused with the mug, hovering near her lips, noticing how the warmth spread through her hands. It made her think of how many mornings she'd rushed past moments like this without ever really feeling them. The idea hadn't started with her. It rarely does. A few weeks earlier, she'd overheard a conversation at the grocery store. Of all places, two men, maybe in their 40s, standing by the coffee aisle. One of them laughed and said something about how even tech guys like Elon Musk are obsessed with what they put in their coffee these days. The other replied that everyone seemed to be adding something: powders, spices, supplements, looking for an edge. Linda hadn't stopped to listen. She didn't need an edge. What she needed, she often thought, was steadiness. Still, the phrase lingered with her longer than she expected. Not because of the name drop, but because of the ritual itself. Coffee was already part of her life. It wasn't a new habit to force herself into, like joining a gym she'd never go to. It was right there every morning, waiting. Later that week, she found herself standing in the pantry, holding a small container she'd picked up almost absent-mindedly. It wasn't expensive. It didn't promise anything bold on the label. It was just a powder people talked about adding to coffee. She'd placed it on the shelf and left it there, untouched, as days passed. Linda smiled now, remembering how long it had taken her to actually open it. That hesitation felt familiar. With age, she'd learned that skepticism wasn't negativity, it was discernment. You earn it by being disappointed enough times. The science she'd skimmed online hadn't overwhelmed her. Most of it was phrased cautiously, anyway, framed as what researchers often explore or what many people notice over time. Nothing definitive. Well, nothing guaranteed. That, strangely, made it feel more believable. She had finally decided to try it, not on a Monday, when expectations feel heavier, but on a quiet Thursday. No witnesses, no pressure, just curiosity. Back in the kitchen, she lowered herself into the chair by the window. Outside, a neighbor walked his dog, the same one he walked every morning at nearly the same time. The dog stopped at the same patch of grass. The world, it seemed, was still keeping its routines. Linda thought about how aging had changed her relationship with her body. In her 30s, she'd pushed through fatigue without thinking twice. In her 40s and 50s, she'd negotiated with it. Now, she listened more closely, not anxiously, just attentively, like you listen to an old car you've driven for years, knowing its sounds, its moods. Many people notice that as they get older, energy becomes less about doing more and more about managing what's already there. Linda felt that truth in her bones. It wasn't that she wanted to feel young again. She wanted to feel present. She took another sip. What surprised her wasn't a surge of anything. It was the absence of tension. Her breath felt slower. Her thoughts less scattered. She reminded herself firmly that this was her personal experience, a reflection of what she felt in that moment, not proof of anything larger. She knew how powerful expectation could be. She'd seen placebo effects discussed on morning shows and in articles shared by friends. And yet, the feeling was real to her. She thought about how often Americans her age are told to overhaul their lives, change everything, eat differently, move differently, think differently. The advice piles up until it feels heavier than helpful. Standing there with her mug, Linda felt something closer to permission than instruction. Permission to try something small. Permission to notice without judging. There was a quiet dignity in that. As the morning unfolded, she moved through her usual tasks, watering the plants, folding a load of laundry, jotting a short grocery list. The clock seemed less aggressive somehow, its ticking less like a demand and more like a reminder that time was passing whether she rushed or not. She wasn't claiming anything had changed her health. She wasn't telling herself a story about transformation. What she allowed herself instead was simpler. The acknowledgement that small rituals can subtly shape how a day begins. Linda glanced at the mug again, now empty, a faint ring left at the bottom. It struck her that so much of life at this stage was about these quiet observations. Noticing what supports you, noticing what drains you, letting go of the need to announce every experiment as a breakthrough. She rinsed the cup and set it in the drying rack, already thinking about tomorrow morning, not with excitement, but with calm curiosity. Sometimes, she thought, it isn't the thing you add that matters most. It's the attention you give, the moment you're already in. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? I didn't expect anything to change. This story is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. Linda said the words out loud as she stood in the hallway the next morning, buttoning her sweater. She wasn't talking to anyone. It was more of a reminder to herself, the kind you offer quietly so expectations don't get ahead of you. At her age, she'd learned that disappointment often begins where certainty sneaks in. The house smelled faintly of coffee, even though the mug was already in the sink. Outside, the sky hung low and gray, the kind of Midwestern morning that makes you reach for an extra layer. Linda paused by the mirror, catching her own reflection. The woman looking back at her seemed the same as always, soft lines at the corners of her eyes, hair she'd stopped fighting with years ago. Nothing about her appearance suggested anything new had begun. And yet, something in her posture felt different. Not stronger, just less guarded. She thought back to the moment she'd stirred the powder into her coffee the day before. No ceremony, no dramatic pause, just a spoon tapping lightly against ceramic. If she was being honest, she'd half expected to feel foolish afterward, the way she had after so many well-meaning experiments over the years. The stretching class she quit after 2 sessions. The supplements that promised clarity and delivered nothing but an empty bottle. Those experiences had taught her a kind of emotional thrift. She didn't spend hope easily anymore. As she drove to the grocery store, the radio played softly, a talk show host discussing the latest wellness trends. Linda smiled at the irony. Everyone seemed to be searching for a lever they could pull, a switch they could flip. She turned the volume down, preferring the hum of the road. What she'd felt yesterday wasn't a trend. It was a moment. She remembered how afternoons used to sneak up on her. Around 2 or 3, her energy would dip, her patience thinning like old fabric. She'd plan her day around it, scheduling errands early, saving easier tasks for later. It wasn't dramatic, just a steady adjustment many people make as they get older. You learn your rhythms because you have to. Yesterday afternoon, she'd noticed the dip hadn't felt as sharp. Not gone, just gentler. She hesitated, even thinking that thought, wary of attributing it to anything specific. Our minds, she knew, are excellent storytellers. They connect dots whether or not they belong together. Still, the noticing mattered. At the store, Linda moved through the aisles at her usual pace. She wasn't energized in a way that made her rush. If anything, she felt more patient. She took time reading labels, comparing prices, choosing produce that felt right rather than just familiar. It struck her that feeling steadier made her less reactive. She wasn't pushing through the day or bracing against it. Many people notice that, as routines harden over time, curiosity softens. You stop experimenting because the cost of disappointment feels higher. Linda had felt that narrowing in herself. Somewhere along the way, she decided it was safer to stick with what she knew, even if what she knew left her feeling a little dulled. Adding something small to her coffee hadn't reopened the world, but it had cracked the door. The science she'd glanced at came back to her in fragments, not facts. Researchers often talk about how certain nutrients are involved in how our bodies manage energy, stress, and focus. It's usually described in careful language, supporting processes, contributing to balance, no absolutes. Linda appreciated that tone. It matched her reality. Bodies aren't machines you upgrade, they're ecosystems you tend. She thought of her coffee like a familiar room. The powder hadn't changed the room itself. It was more like opening a window a few inches. The furniture stayed the same. The view didn't suddenly transform, but the air moved. Back home, she set the groceries down and made a simple lunch. As she ate, she noticed something else. Her thoughts felt less crowded. She wasn't replaying conversations or worrying ahead as much. Again, she told herself, this was what she felt, not a universal truth. But feelings are data too, in their own quiet way. Linda had once read that paying attention is a form of care. She'd brushed it off at the time, thinking care required action. Now, she wasn't so sure. Maybe attention was the action. In the afternoon, she called her sister. They talked about ordinary things, a neighbor's new fence, an upcoming birthday, the weather. Linda caught herself listening more closely, not waiting for her turn to speak. That surprised her. It had been a long time since conversations felt that unhurried. She didn't mention the coffee. It wasn't ready to be shared yet. Some experiences need to settle before they're spoken aloud. As evening approached, Linda reflected on how easily she could have missed all of this if she'd decided it was silly. If she'd dismissed her own curiosity. So much of aging, she realized, is learning what to ignore. The risk is ignoring yourself along with the noise. She wasn't chasing a better version of herself. She was learning to be more present with the one she already was. Before bed, she rinsed the mug again, setting it out for the morning. There was no excitement in the gesture, just intention. Sometimes the most meaningful changes don't announce themselves. They whisper, and you only hear them if you're willing to listen. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? He puts it right in his coffee. This story is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. The words drifted across the cafe like steam, detached from the people who said them. Linda hadn't been trying to listen. She was seated near the window, hands wrapped around her mug, watching traffic inch along the street. The place was busy in that gentle, late-morning way, retirees lingering over refills, a few laptops open, the low hum of conversation blending with the hiss of the espresso machine. She might have missed it entirely if the sentence hadn't ended so casually, as if it were nothing special at all. Who? Someone asked. You know, the voice replied, Elon Musk, or at least that's what he said in some interview. He's always talking about routines. Linda smiled into her coffee. Names like that floated through conversations everywhere now, especially when people talked about habits and health. It was less about the person and more about what they represented: control, intention, a sense that life could be engineered if you paid enough attention. The women at the next table leaned in, curious but unconvinced. One of them shrugged. Well, if it works for him, that doesn't mean it works for the rest of us. Linda silently agreed. She had no interest in copying someone else's life, especially someone whose days looked nothing like hers. Still, the exchange stayed with her, not because of the name, but because of how lightly it was offered. No pitch, no urgency, just a passing comment folded into an ordinary morning. She thought about how ideas travel now. They don't arrive with instruction manuals. They slip into conversations at cafes, pop up in headlines, appear on morning shows while you're folding laundry. You absorb them without realizing it, and later, sometimes much later, they resurface. That was how the powder had found its way into her pantry. Not through persuasion, but through exposure. Linda took another sip, noticing the way the cafe's warmth settled around her. The coffee here tasted different from hers at home, brighter, a little sharper. She wondered how much of taste was context. The chair you sit in, the mood you're in, the company you keep. Across the room, a man laughed too loudly at his own joke. A couple near the counter debated whether to split a pastry. Life, in all its small negotiations, carried on. She thought about why Americans seem drawn to the routines of famous people. Maybe it's not hero worship. Maybe it's reassurance. If someone with endless options still returns to something as simple as coffee, it suggests simplicity hasn't lost its value. Of course, Linda knew the danger in that thinking too. Observing isn't the same as understanding, and borrowing an idea doesn't mean borrowing the context that made it useful for someone else. She reminded herself that whatever she was exploring belonged firmly in the category of personal experience. What she felt was hers alone. Later that afternoon, as she walked home, the conversation replayed in her mind. She wasn't imagining Elon Musk in his kitchen, measuring out powders or timing his brew. That image felt distant, almost irrelevant. What stayed with her was the ordinariness of the act itself. Coffee, a daily ritual shared by millions, regardless of status. There was something grounding in that. Many studies, she remembered reading, explore how small, consistent habits can influence how people feel over time. Not dramatically, not uniformly, but enough to be noticed by those paying attention. Linda liked that framing. It left room for variation, for choice, for opting out. Back in her own kitchen, she opened the pantry and glanced at the container again. It hadn't changed. No glow, no promise, just a quiet option. She reflected on how often she'd dismissed ideas simply because they arrived wrapped in hype. Perhaps the skill wasn't rejecting everything new, but learning how to strip an idea down to its simplest form. Remove the celebrity, remove the promise, ask what remains. What remained, in this case, was a small addition to a habit she already had. As evening settled in, Linda sat by the window with a book she'd been reading slowly for weeks. She noticed she wasn't rereading paragraphs as often. Her mind didn't wander as quickly. She marked the page and paused, acknowledging the moment without trying to explain it. She thought of something her mother used to say, "You don't have to believe in everything you try, you just have to pay attention." At the time, it had sounded vague. Now, it felt practical. The cafe conversation hadn't convinced her of anything. It hadn't needed to. It had simply reminded her that curiosity is contagious. It moves quietly from person to person, often without permission. Linda closed the book and turned off the light, the echo of that fragmented sentence still floating somewhere in her thoughts. Sometimes it's not the advice that stays with you. It's the offhand remark you weren't meant to hear. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? When afternoons feel heavier than mornings. This story is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. Linda sank into the armchair by the living room window, a soft blanket draped over her knees. Outside, the wind rustled the bare branches, carrying the first whispers of winter across the quiet street. The house smelled faintly of last night's dinner and coffee lingering on the counter. She picked up her mug, now empty, and rested her hands around it, feeling the warmth linger like a faint echo. She had noticed a change in the past few days, not dramatic, not miraculous, just subtle. Her energy, usually fragile after midday, seemed steadier. She reminded herself that small differences often feel bigger in hindsight. Many people notice that, as the body ages, its rhythms shift. The afternoons can drag. Energy wanes. Tasks that felt easy at 30 suddenly require negotiation with the body. Linda liked to think of her energy as a car engine. In her youth, it ran fast, sometimes recklessly, without much maintenance. You could push it hard, and it would roar back. Now, at 68, it demanded care, gentle fueling, timely oiling. Skip a day of attention, and it sputters. Overdo it, and it overheats. Observing the engine, rather than pushing it, became her quiet practice. She remembered reading that many researchers describe energy as a balance of systems, affected by sleep, nutrition, movement, and the mind's quiet chatter. No magic bullet, no overnight fix, just steady input, steady awareness. That explanation resonated with her. It framed her experience not as decline but as adjustment. Last week, she had tried adding the powder to her coffee, not because she expected it to solve anything, but because the act itself created a moment of mindfulness. Stirring the spoon in circles, inhaling the aroma, pausing to notice the steam rising, had a subtle effect. She found that rituals, even small ones, influence how the body and mind move through the day. Linda's attention wandered to her garden outside, now resting under frost. Gardening had taught her patience. You plant seeds, water them, pull weeds, and wait. Some days, you see growth. Some days you don't. You don't force the plant to bloom. You support what it already is capable of. That, she realized, was the same principle she was discovering with her mornings and her energy. You support what's already there. You don't push against it. She smiled softly, thinking of how this perspective applied to meals, walks, and even conversations. Adjusting her pace, choosing which tasks demanded focus and which could wait, had changed how she felt by 3 o'clock without doing anything dramatically different. Her personal reflection deepened as she sipped water from a glass on the side table. Life after 60 often demands awareness rather than effort, listening rather than forcing. She observed the subtle tension in her shoulders and consciously released it. She noticed the light on the kitchen floor, the neighbor's cat sitting patiently at the fence, the gentle hum of her refrigerator. Moments like these, previously invisible in the rush of routine, now carried weight. Linda recalled her own mother's words. The body isn't a battery you can recharge instantly. It's more like a garden, you tend it. That saying had made little sense when she was younger. Now, every observation of her own energy patterns resonated with it. There was power in small attentions, in consistency, in gentle care. She rose slowly, stretching her arms over her head, feeling the muscles ease into movement. 2 small actions came to mind for the next day. 1. A short walk before breakfast to prime the body gently. 2. A mindful pause with her coffee to center the mind. Tiny habits, framed as intentional acts rather than chores, could influence how she moved through her afternoons. Linda felt hope, not as a surge of excitement, but as calm reassurance. She was learning that tending to herself didn't require dramatic gestures. The coffee, the powder, the pause, they weren't cures or guarantees. They were invitations to observe, to notice, to participate in her own life with kindness. Before leaving the room, she looked out at the pale sky and the quiet street. There was comfort in realizing that attention, consistency, and gentle curiosity could shape the flow of a day. She realized this was the real benefit, noticing, nurturing, and engaging with life in a way that made the afternoons feel lighter. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? The jar sat there for weeks, untouched. This story is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. Linda leaned against the kitchen counter, staring at the small container on the shelf. It was unremarkable in appearance, a simple unbranded jar with a neutral label, nothing flashy, nothing commanding attention. Yet somehow, it had become a presence in her daily routine, a quiet reminder of curiosity she hadn't fully acted upon. For weeks, it had remained untouched. Not out of fear or indecision, but out of that familiar mix of caution and practicality that comes with age. Americans like Linda often develop a rhythm, habits honed over decades, routines that provide stability, and a healthy skepticism of anything promising change without effort. This jar, despite its unassuming size, had the power to disrupt that rhythm, if she let it. Linda thought about why she had bought it in the first place. A casual conversation, a fleeting curiosity sparked by reading about different ways people experiment with their morning coffee. No guarantees, no claims she could trust, just the sense that trying it might offer insight, a tiny shift, a small perspective. That was enough to bring it home. Her personal reflection drifted to the nature of small objects in everyday life. How often had she overlooked them, only to realize later that they had quietly shaped her thoughts, her routines, her sense of self. A favorite pen that encourages journaling, a worn pair of slippers that signal comfort, a jar of something new that quietly invites curiosity. Objects are not magic, but they are reminders of what we choose to notice. Linda's fingers traced the rim of the jar absently. Many people notice that adding something small to an established routine often feels disproportionately meaningful. It's not that the jar itself holds power. It's that the act of considering it, preparing it, acknowledging it, brings attention to the ritual. That afternoon, she reflected on the lessons of the past few weeks. Energy, she had learned, is rarely about radical interventions. It's about subtle adjustments, observation, and awareness. The jar wasn't a shortcut or a solution, it was a symbol, a token of willingness to engage with life differently, if only a little. Her mind wandered to how Americans often treat these little additions. A new kitchen gadget, a spice, a supplement, sometimes they stay on the shelf, sometimes they become rituals. The difference lies not in the object itself, but in the relationship one develops with it. Linda liked the thought that she could choose when and how to engage, and that choice was entirely hers. She remembered stirring it into her coffee the first time. The spoon tapped against the ceramic. Steam rose in lazy spirals, and she paused to inhale the aroma. It had felt simple, almost mundane, yet unexpectedly grounding. The jar had transformed from an object of indecision to a tool of mindfulness. Linda smiled to herself, thinking of the subtle philosophy in everyday objects. A cup, a chair, a jar, they don't tell us what to do. They invite attention, they hold space for observation. They remind us that life is composed of small, meaningful moments, easily overlooked but quietly potent. Later that evening, as she tidied the kitchen, Linda set the jar back on the shelf deliberately. Its presence no longer intimidated her. Instead, it felt reassuring, a small emblem of curiosity honored. She realized that sometimes the most significant step isn't adding something new, but allowing it to exist in your life without pressure, observing how it interacts with you over time. In the quiet of her home, she reflected on what many people notice as they grow older. Change doesn't always arrive as a flood. It often creeps in as a whisper. A small object on a shelf. A new habit tried and abandoned. A simple moment of attention. And sometimes, the most profound shifts start with that quiet willingness to notice. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? The first sip was warmer than she expected. This story is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. Linda held her coffee mug carefully, tilting it toward her lips. Steam rose in delicate curls, carrying the familiar aroma that had accompanied so many of her mornings. The powder she had added days ago had faded from novelty into ritual, but today, as she tasted it, she noticed something subtle. The flavor felt richer, smoother, like a morning she hadn't quite remembered having. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. There was no surge of energy, no sudden clarity that solved lingering problems. Instead, it was the quietness of the moment that caught her attention. Many people notice that perception, even without measurable changes, can shape experience. The warmth in her hands, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the sunlight hitting the countertop just right, all combined to make the ordinary extraordinary. As she sipped, Linda reflected on the ritual itself. Coffee had always been her anchor, a pause before the day demanded action. Stirring the powder in yesterday had felt like a small act of care, but now the act was embedded into her rhythm. She realized that rituals, small, intentional, repeated, carry power not through the objects themselves, but through the attention and presence they cultivate. She thought of the kitchen as a stage. The kettle hissed, the spoon tapped against the mug, sunlight painted stripes across the floorboards. Even mundane sounds took on new meaning when she noticed them. Life, she mused, is often about these details, overlooked yet vital, like a thread running through the fabric of ordinary days. Her mind wandered to the science she'd read in passing. Many studies discuss how sensory experiences, taste, warmth, aroma, can influence mood and alertness. The effect is subtle, cumulative, and personal. There were no guarantees, only observations, but that was enough. Linda appreciated the gentle interplay between her senses and her attention. It reminded her that she could participate in her own well-being without chasing dramatic solutions. The first sip brought a reflection. Attention itself can amplify experience. She thought of gardening, of tending to plants she had nurtured for years. Adding water, trimming leaves, adjusting light, they didn't force growth, but they allowed it to unfold. Similarly, adding a pinch of something to her coffee didn't promise anything extraordinary, but it allowed her to notice the ordinary differently. Linda's cat brushed against her leg, demanding a morning scratch. She bent down, laughing softly at the insistence of routine. Moments like these, small, seemingly insignificant, shaped the tone of her day far more than she often acknowledged. The coffee, the ritual, the attention, they weren't cures. They were invitations to presence. By mid-morning, she felt steadier, not in energy measured by a clock, but in focus, in the subtle ease of movement. She reminded herself that this was personal reflection, not a universal claim. Still, there was joy in noticing shifts, however small, in how she experienced the day. She reflected on how Americans, especially seniors, often chase grand solutions, overlooking the quiet influence of simple rituals. A cup of coffee, a few mindful moments, a gentle pause, these can anchor mornings and soothe afternoons. As she finished her mug, she let herself linger in the sensation of warmth and calm. She realized that the act of noticing was transformative in its own way. The powder, the mug, the steam, they were catalysts for attention, not miracles. That distinction mattered. Linda set the empty cup on the counter, watching the steam fade, thinking about how small rituals like this shape, not the body, but the day itself. She felt gratitude for the quiet morning, for the ritual she had honored, for the patience she was cultivating with herself. Sometimes, she thought, it isn't the thing you add that changes the day, it's the moment you take to truly experience it. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? She hesitated before opening the lid. This story is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. Linda's fingers lingered on the small jar, as if pausing might change what was inside. It had become a familiar presence in her kitchen, yet every time she reached for it, a quiet hesitation returned. It wasn't fear or doubt, it was the careful attention that had grown with age. Years of navigating choices, from health to household decisions, had taught her that pausing could be as valuable as acting. She finally opened the lid, releasing a faint, earthy scent that reminded her of mornings spent in the garden, stirring soil, inhaling the crisp air. The powder's aroma was subtle, unassuming, just enough to anchor her senses without overwhelming them. Linda smiled. It was never about novelty, it was about noticing. As she stirred it into her coffee, she reflected on the small transformations that occur when attention is given to ordinary acts. Many people notice that rituals, even minute ones, shape the tone of the day. The way the spoon taps against the mug, the rising steam, the warmth cradled in your hands, these sensory details matter more than one might expect. She recalled her mother's words, "Little things done with care make a life worth living." That phrase had always sounded quaint, almost sentimental, but now it resonated differently. Life at her age was less about dramatic milestones and more about these quiet acts of presence. The coffee tasted familiar, yet richer in a way she couldn't entirely explain. Perhaps it was the anticipation, or the deliberate pause before drinking. Linda noticed her shoulders relax, her breath deepen. She thought of how energy ebbs and flows through the day. Afternoon fatigue wasn't a flaw, it was a signal to adjust, to honor the body's rhythms rather than fight them. Many studies suggest that routine, mindfulness, and small intentional changes can subtly influence well-being. It isn't about miraculous effects, but about supporting processes that already exist. Linda thought of her mornings like tending a garden, watering seeds of attention, pulling weeds of distraction, allowing sunlight to illuminate the familiar corners of life. Her mind wandered to the day ahead, a walk to the mailbox, tidying the living room, maybe calling a friend. Each task seemed lighter than usual. Perhaps it was the pause, the deliberate noticing, or the simple ritual of her morning coffee. Whatever the cause, she felt steadier, calmer, more present. Linda chuckled softly at her own reflection. How often had she overlooked these small influences, waiting instead for bold shifts or dramatic fixes? Life, she realized, rarely worked that way. The magic was in noticing, in choosing to engage with ordinary moments fully. As she rinsed the mug and returned the jar to the shelf, she felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, not from any measurable gain, but from honoring a simple ritual, observing its effect, and allowing herself to be present. Sometimes, the most meaningful changes are invisible at first, whispering rather than announcing themselves. They invite attention and reward patience, creating ripples that gently shape the day. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? The sunlight hit the counter just right. This story is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. Linda paused at the kitchen window, letting the pale winter light spill over her hands as she cradled her mug. The steam rose slowly, curling like a delicate ribbon, and for a moment, everything else, the errands, the calls, the endless lists, faded into the background. She breathed in the warmth and the scent, noticing it fully. It wasn't the coffee itself that made the moment special, nor the powder she had added. It was the attention she gave to it, the way she slowed her pace to allow herself to experience the ordinary differently. Many people notice that as routines solidify with age, it's not the grand gestures but these tiny pauses that make life feel more manageable. Linda thought about the rhythm of her mornings. In her 40s, she had rushed through breakfast, emails, and household chores, often spilling coffee on herself in the process. In her 60s, she moved differently, more deliberately, more thoughtfully. She realized that noticing subtle shifts in her energy, even the quiet steadiness that came from small rituals, made the day unfold more smoothly. The powder, innocuous and simple, had become part of that ritual, not because it promised energy or clarity, but because it anchored her attention. She stirred it in, inhaled the aroma, and paused to feel the warmth in her hands. That pause was enough. It reminded her that well-being isn't always about dramatic solutions. Sometimes it's about presence. She remembered reading that many studies show consistent, gentle habits influence both mood and focus over time. Small, intentional adjustments like the ritual of coffee in the morning help people manage energy in ways that feel natural and sustainable. Linda liked thinking of herself as tending a garden. Each morning was a chance to nurture herself, to water seeds of awareness and patience that had been planted over decades. Her gaze wandered outside. A neighbor shuffled along the sidewalk, bundled against the cold. The wind moved through bare trees, their skeletal branches tracing patterns against the sky. She noticed the way the sunlight lit a patch of frost, sparkling briefly before melting. There was beauty in these fleeting observations, and a quiet satisfaction in allowing herself to notice them without hurry. Linda's personal reflection drifted to the interplay of mind and body. Energy ebbs and flows in cycles, she realized. Attention and awareness shape how those cycles feel. By taking small, deliberate pauses, she was learning to navigate her days more gracefully. The powder in her coffee wasn't a miracle, it was a gentle nudge, an invitation to notice the ordinary with curiosity. Later, she prepared to walk to the mailbox. Each step felt lighter than usual, not because her body had transformed, but because she had trained her mind to observe and appreciate the small moments. The ritual of the morning carried a subtle influence, threading patience and presence through her day. Before leaving, Linda set the empty mug in the drying rack. She smiled at the sunlight that lingered on the counter, thinking about how awareness, more than any object or habit, shapes experience. Sometimes, the smallest shifts, like noticing sunlight or steam or warmth, ripple through the rest of the day in ways that are invisible but profound. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? She whispered it to herself before anyone arrived. This story is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. Linda stood in the hallway, keys in hand, pausing for a moment before stepping outside. The winter air was crisp, carrying faint traces of damp leaves and distant traffic. She whispered the words quietly, almost as a ritual. One step at a time. It wasn't a mantra, not exactly, but a gentle acknowledgement that each day required intention, even in the smallest acts. The powder in her morning coffee had become part of a larger story she was quietly writing for herself. It wasn't transformative in the dramatic sense, nor was it a fix for fatigue or forgetfulness. Instead, it offered a small, tangible moment to anchor her awareness, an invitation to notice, to pause, to engage with life fully. Many people observe that such minor, deliberate rituals accumulate, subtly influencing mood, energy, and clarity without the need for dramatic intervention. As she walked down the street, Linda felt the rhythm of her body, each step connecting with the crisp pavement. She remembered how her mornings used to be rushed, fueled by habit rather than attention. The energy dips, the tension in her shoulders, the racing thoughts, it all seemed unavoidable at the time. But now, she noticed differences, subtle though they were. The afternoons didn't feel as heavy, the mind less cluttered, the patience more abundant. Linda reflected on how routines shape perception. Just as a gardener tends soil, checking for moisture and growth, she had begun tending her own days with quiet care. Adding the powder to her coffee wasn't about expecting results. It was about creating a deliberate pause, a moment to observe rather than rush. That pause, over time, became a lens through which she noticed her energy, her focus, and her mood shifting gently. Many studies suggest that small, consistent actions influence how people feel and think. Not in bold, dramatic strokes, but in subtle ways that accumulate over time. Linda appreciated this framing because it mirrored her lived experience. Life wasn't about instant transformations, it was about small attentions, repeated steadily, that shaped well-being in ways both visible and invisible. She reached the mailbox and bent to collect letters, feeling the cold bite her cheeks. The simple act of bending and stretching, of engaging with her surroundings, reminded her of the power of minor movements and micro-moments. The powder in her coffee had no magical effect, yet its presence marked her morning with intention, allowing her to move through the day more consciously. On the walk back, Linda passed a neighbor raking leaves. She smiled and nodded, feeling the ease of unhurried connection. Even brief interactions took on new weight when approached with awareness. Small gestures, mindful attention, and the acknowledgement of routine all seemed to ripple quietly through her day. Returning home, she placed the letters on the counter and rinsed the mug from breakfast. She lingered, watching the steam rise briefly before fading. That ephemeral swirl mirrored the subtlety of change itself, gentle, quiet, almost imperceptible, yet shaping experience over time. Linda felt a calm reassurance settle over her. She didn't need proof, validation, or a dramatic shift. Observing small differences, honoring simple rituals, and noticing moments of presence were enough. It was in these tiny choices that life unfolded with more ease and clarity. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? The mug rattled lightly on the counter. This story is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. Linda paused, letting the sound echo softly in the quiet kitchen. It was an ordinary morning, yet somehow the ordinary felt different. The powder she had added to her coffee weeks ago had become a subtle ritual, one she barely noticed until she caught herself appreciating it. Not because it promised anything miraculous, but because the act itself created space to pause, to observe, to notice the rhythms of her body and mind. Many people notice that with age, small habits accumulate into meaningful patterns. Energy that once felt fleeting now moved in gentle waves. Afternoons no longer hit with abrupt fatigue, but with softer dips that could be navigated with awareness. Linda thought about how tiny actions like stirring a spoon in a mug can become anchors in the ebb and flow of daily life. She remembered yesterday's walk down the neighborhood street. The chill in the air, the distant bark of a dog, the crunch of frost underfoot, moments that previously would have gone unnoticed now held weight. Attention, she realized, is the invisible ingredient in how we experience the world. The powder wasn't magic. It was a tool, a gentle reminder to be present. Her personal reflection drifted to the mornings she had rushed through in her 40s. Breakfast was a blur, emails were urgent, the day demanded more than she could give. Now, she had learned to slow, to breathe, to honor the small pauses. Even a mundane task like making coffee became a small ceremony, a way to begin the day with intentionality. According to many studies, consistent routines, even minor ones, can subtly influence energy levels, focus, and mood. They create a scaffolding that supports the mind and body, allowing natural rhythms to settle instead of being pushed and pulled. Linda appreciated that phrasing. Life wasn't about instant results. It was about gentle adjustments, attentive observation, and repeated small choices. She lifted the mug, inhaling the faint aroma and feeling the warmth seep into her palms. The steam curled, a soft reminder that the ordinary could be beautiful when noticed. Linda thought about how often Americans overlook these small pleasures, chasing dramatic solutions instead. It wasn't necessary. Presence, awareness, and gentle rituals were enough to transform experience from mundane to meaningful. Later, as she tidied the kitchen, Linda reflected on the day ahead. Two small actions came to mind: a short stretch before lunch to ease stiffness, and a mindful pause with her afternoon tea to observe sensations rather than rush. Tiny adjustments, simple to implement, could ripple through the day in ways that weren't always measurable but were deeply felt. By evening, she settled in with a book, the house quiet and calm. She thought about the way attention had shifted her perception. The powder, the mug, The morning ritual, none of it was miraculous, but each small, consistent choice created a framework for noticing and appreciating life. Linda smiled softly, realizing that change rarely announces itself. It whispers, it unfolds in subtle ways, shaping days, moods, and perceptions through gentle, deliberate attention. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? She tapped the spoon twice before stirring. This story is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. Linda paused in her kitchen, spoon poised above the coffee mug, feeling the tiny weight of the ritual she had now repeated countless mornings. The powder had become almost invisible in her routine, its presence acknowledged more by habit than intention, but in this moment, she noticed it again. That tiny pause before stirring allowed her mind to settle, like the quiet moment before a deep exhale. She thought about how ordinary mornings could feel extraordinary when approached with attention. Many people notice that life after 60 often requires smaller, gentler rhythms. Energy, focus, and patience no longer surge by default. They are cultivated like careful garden work. A habit as simple as stirring a mug of coffee could create a thread of mindfulness through the day, anchoring moments of calm amid responsibilities, errands, and social obligations. Linda's personal reflection drifted to the weeks she had been observing these small rituals. She hadn't expected anything dramatic from a jar of powder, but she noticed that the act itself, the deliberate stirring, the aroma, the warmth cradled in her hands, felt like a signal to her body and mind. Pay attention. This is your moment. The subtle awareness cultivated here rippled outward, coloring her entire morning. She remembered reading that many studies suggest consistent, small, intentional routines can subtly influence energy, cognition, and mood over time. Not guaranteed, not dramatic, just quietly cumulative. Linda liked that perspective. It mirrored her own experience. Change didn't always arrive with fireworks. Often it appeared in unnoticed ripples, shaping perception and response over weeks and months. The morning light spilled across the counter, illuminating the steam curling from her mug. She inhaled deeply, noticing the smell, the heat, the fleeting visual patterns that would be gone in moments. Life, she realized, was full of these ephemeral details, and noticing them created a richness that was often overlooked. Linda's gaze fell on the window outside. Snow had begun to dust the sidewalks, and the neighborhood looked serene under the soft white blanket. She thought about how subtle adjustments, adding a small ritual, observing energy cycles, slowing attention could shape not just a single morning but the tone of a whole day. The powder wasn't transformative on its own, but it had become a conduit for presence. Later, as she walked to check the mail, she felt steadier in her step. The simple act of noticing small shifts, the balance in her body, the quiet ease in her mind made the walk feel lighter. It wasn't about doing more, it was about observing and allowing small practices to accumulate naturally. Back in the kitchen, Linda rinsed the mug and returned the jar to its spot. It sat quietly on the shelf, unassuming yet meaningful. She appreciated its presence, not for what it promised, but for the way it encouraged attention, patience, and reflection. That, she realized, was more powerful than any dramatic solution could be. Sometimes, she thought, the smallest gestures, tapping a spoon, inhaling a scent, pausing for a breath, become the anchors that shape experience, ripple by ripple, through a day, and, eventually, a life. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? She let the steam rise, watching it curl into the morning light. This story is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. Linda held her coffee mug in both hands, savoring the warmth as the pale sunlight filtered through the kitchen window. The powder had become part of her morning ritual, a quiet companion that asked for nothing but her attention. Today, she noticed it anew, not for any dramatic effect, but for the gentle rhythm it brought to her start of day. Many people notice that small, repeated acts, rituals, habits, or even tiny pauses can subtly shape mood, focus, and energy. Life after 60 often asks for this kind of gentle engagement. The afternoons that once dragged now had texture, movement felt steadier, and the mind, though never entirely quiet, had pockets of calm. Linda recognized that this shift was not about any miraculous change, but about the attentive choices she made consistently. Her personal reflection wandered to the months she had spent observing these mornings. Each sip, each stir, each pause became a thread, connecting her to herself. She noticed the delicate interplay of senses, the aroma rising, the warmth in her hands, the way the steam danced in the light. These small experiences, repeated and cherished, created an unspoken architecture of calm in her days. She recalled how many studies suggest that mindful routines, even as simple as preparing coffee, can have subtle effects on energy, alertness, and mood. Not as a cure or guarantee, but as a scaffold that supports the body and mind in their natural rhythms. Linda liked this perspective because it mirrored her lived experience. Gentle, cumulative, personal. Looking out the window, she watched a neighbor walk a dog, the small figure moving steadily across the street. Even the briefest interactions, she realized, could carry meaning when attention was given. Life, she thought, was composed of these interwoven threads, the small rituals, the sensory moments, the quiet awareness. Linda's gaze returned to her mug. She swirled it gently, watching the powder dissolve completely, merging into the familiar color of her coffee. She smiled softly, reflecting on how much presence this small act invited. The powder itself did nothing miraculous, but it was an instrument of noticing, of paying attention, of creating space for intention in otherwise ordinary mornings. Later, she stretched and prepared for her day. A short walk, a phone call to a friend, tending to a houseplant, each action carried a weight it never had before, because she approached it with mindful attention. The morning ritual of coffee and powder had become a gentle lens, shaping perception, pacing, and experience in ways invisible yet profoundly felt. Linda set the empty mug on the counter, letting the light catch the steam one last time. She felt gratitude for the ritual, for the quiet accumulation of mindful moments, and for the subtle ways small choices had shaped her days. She realized that the true power of change lies not in dramatic interventions, but in the simple willingness to notice, to pause, and to engage gently with life. Sometimes, she thought, the tiniest gestures, sipping slowly, inhaling deeply, stirring intentionally, can ripple through an entire day, altering its texture and tone. And over time, these ripples accumulate into something meaningful, quiet, and sustaining. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? The envelope sat unopened on the counter. I was actually, and of here one. I would have here. This story is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. Linda noticed the envelope that had arrived the day before, its edges slightly bent from the mail. For a moment, she hesitated, not because of fear or expectation, but because the pause allowed her to center herself. She took a deep breath, holding her coffee mug in one hand and the envelope in the other, feeling the warmth of the liquid seep into her palms. These small rituals, the powder in her coffee, the attention she brought to each sip, had taught her patience and presence in ways she hadn't anticipated. Life at her age often required these quiet pauses. Many people notice that energy and focus don't surge automatically as they once did. Instead, they respond to gentle, consistent habits that cultivate awareness and intention. The powder wasn't a cure or a guarantee, but it had become part of her toolkit for noticing and engaging fully with the world around her. As she opened the envelope, she reflected on the metaphor it represented. Just like the seemingly small acts of stirring a mug, paying attention to her mornings, or walking slowly down a frost-dusted street, opening this envelope was a deliberate acknowledgement of something she had been holding at arm's length. It wasn't dramatic, but it mattered. Her personal reflection returned to the morning routine she had cultivated over the past weeks. Each sip of coffee, each swirl of powder, each pause had accumulated into a subtle rhythm, shaping her perception of energy and calm. She realized that small rituals could influence not just the start of the day, but the mindset carried into every interaction and task. According to many studies, small, repeated, mindful actions can influence mood, focus, and energy over time. These effects are not instantaneous or guaranteed, but they create scaffolding for the mind and body. Linda appreciated this explanation, as it mirrored her experience. Attention and care were more powerful than any dramatic intervention could be. She thought of the letter as another small ritual, a gentle nudge to engage with life deliberately. Its contents were ordinary, yet by approaching them with mindfulness, she found richness and meaning. It reminded her that attention transforms experience, and that small choices often ripple outward in unexpected ways. Linda set the envelope aside after reading. letting herself linger in the quiet satisfaction of intentional action. She looked out the window at the neighborhood street, noticing patterns she had previously overlooked, the way sunlight reflected off frost, the way neighbors' movements followed subtle rhythms of the morning. These observations, she realized, were shaped by the very rituals she had built: coffee, attention, pause. The day stretched ahead, familiar yet new. Linda felt steadier, calmer, more present, not because of any miraculous change, but because she had practiced noticing, cultivating awareness, and honoring small actions. She understood now that life's richness is composed of these tiny, deliberate choices, often invisible but deeply influential. Sometimes, the smallest gestures: pausing before opening an envelope, stirring a mug slowly, inhaling the aroma of coffee ripple through the day, shaping perception, energy, and mood in ways that are quiet but profound. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? She traced the rim of her mug absent-mindedly. This story is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. Linda sat at the kitchen table, fingers gently circling the mug in front of her. The powder she had been adding to her coffee had long since become a quiet companion in her mornings, almost invisible yet profoundly anchoring. Today, she noticed it again, not for any sudden energy or clarity it promised, but for the gentle invitation it offered to be fully present. Many people notice that as life progresses, energy becomes more about awareness than raw stamina. The small rituals, the warmth of a cup, the aroma rising from freshly stirred coffee, the act of paying attention help guide the body and mind through the day. Linda's mornings had become a canvas for these subtle adjustments, moments to cultivate calm before stepping into the noise and demands of life. Her personal reflection drifted to the past week. She had observed herself moving through routine with more steadiness, noticing small shifts in focus and patience. The powder, seemingly minor, had become a trigger for these observations, a gentle reminder that paying attention could influence experience, even when nothing outwardly dramatic happened. Science, in its quiet way, supports this. Many studies suggest that consistent, mindful habits, small, intentional rituals, affect mood, focus, and energy. The effects are cumulative and subtle, not miraculous or guaranteed, but they scaffold the rhythms of daily life. Linda appreciated this framing. It aligned with what she was learning firsthand. Change is often a whisper, not a shout. She looked out the window, noting the frost melting in the morning sun, the way a neighbor's cat padded along the fence. Life was full of small details easily overlooked, yet observing them brought unexpected satisfaction. It reminded her of how subtle attention, like stirring the powder into her coffee mindfully, could ripple through her day, shaping perception and mood without demanding dramatic effort. Linda smiled softly at the quiet lesson. Rushing, she realized, had never enhanced her mornings. Presence had. The small acts she had built into her routine: the pause before lifting the mug, the scent of coffee, the warm sensation in her hands, were small gestures that shaped her experience. They were tiny acts of self-care, easily overlooked, but quietly transformative over time. Later, she prepared for a short walk. Each step felt lighter, more deliberate, the rhythm of her movements mirroring the calm attention she had cultivated. The powder had not changed her energy outright, but it had created a habit of noticing, a lens through which the ordinary became meaningful. As she returned home and set the empty mug aside, Linda reflected on the subtle wisdom of small routines. Life did not need drama or instant solutions. Sometimes, the quiet accumulation of mindful moments, pausing, noticing, stirring, inhaling, created a resilience and calm that shaped the day from start to finish. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? The mug rattled softly against the saucer, a tiny percussion to start the day. This story is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. Linda held her coffee carefully, feeling the warmth seep into her palms and the steam curl upward, brushing against her cheeks. The powder had become part of her morning ritual, a quiet, almost invisible companion that reminded her to pause, breathe, and notice. Today, she lingered longer than usual, letting her senses take in the aroma, the texture of the mug, the soft hum of the refrigerator. It was an ordinary morning, yet she felt an unusual clarity, a gentle presence that made each detail vivid. She thought about how mornings used to be. Years ago, her 40s had been a blur of rushing emails, errands, breakfast swallowed hastily, while juggling phone calls. Energy came and went unpredictably, focus was fleeting, and she often felt worn before the day had even begun. She realized now that the difference wasn't in some miraculous fix, but in the deliberate, gentle rituals she had built. The powder in her coffee wasn't transformative on its own, it was the attention it invited, the pause it represented, that mattered. Many people notice that, as we age, small habits begin to shape experience more than dramatic interventions. Just as gardeners water plants and adjust sunlight to nurture growth, tiny, intentional acts influence how we feel, move, and think. Linda's reflection this morning reminded her of that analogy. Stirring her coffee, inhaling the scent, cradling the warmth, each small action was like tending her own inner garden, nurturing patience, awareness, and calm. She recalled reading that studies have found subtle routines, morning rituals, mindful observation, small habitual behaviors can influence mood, energy, and cognition over time. The effects are not guaranteed or instantaneous, but they accumulate quietly, shaping perception and creating a framework for presence. Linda appreciated this because it mirrored her lived experience. The changes weren't dramatic, but they were tangible in the way her days felt smoother, her mind steadier, and her patience longer. See, for their minus, as she sipped her coffee, she watched the steam curl and swirl, catching the morning light. She realized that noticing these tiny details, the heat in her hands, the smell, the movement of air was as nourishing as the coffee itself. Life, she thought, was composed of these imperceptible ripples, tiny gestures, deliberate pauses, mindful observation. They were invisible, yet profoundly shaping the texture of each day. Her personal reflection deepened as she considered the afternoon ahead. There were errands, a short walk to the mailbox, perhaps a phone call to a friend. In the past, these tasks might have felt mundane or draining, but now she approached them differently. The morning ritual had primed her for awareness, giving her the ability to notice the subtle rhythms of her energy, the shifting qualities of focus and calm, and the quiet satisfaction of presence. Linda smiled softly at the realization that these small, repeated actions created momentum. The powder in her coffee had become a symbol, a gentle nudge to pause, to savor, to observe. It wasn't magic, but it worked like magic in shaping her experience, teaching her that attention and intention mattered as much as any external intervention. Later, she went for her walk. Each step on the frost-dusted sidewalk was deliberate, each breath conscious. She noticed the sounds, the crunch of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, the wind moving through bare branches. These were ordinary, everyday things, yet when attended to with gentle awareness, they became rich, grounding experiences. She thought of how easily they could be overlooked, swept away by rushing or distraction. Back at home, Linda prepared her afternoon tea. She noticed the slight resistance of the tea bag as she dipped it, the swirl of liquid darkening with steeping, the aroma rising like a quiet melody. She realized that the day, like a tapestry, was composed of countless small threads. Each thread mattered, and the quality of her attention wove the fabric of her experience. By evening, she felt a steady calm in her body, a quiet lucidity in her mind, a patient warmth in her heart. The powder had not fixed anything, nor had it promised dramatic change, but it had become a vessel for presence, patience, and awareness. In the simple act of noticing the warmth, the scent, the texture, the gentle pause, Linda had discovered a subtle, sustaining shift in how she approached her day. Sometimes, she realized, the smallest gestures, cradling a warm mug, inhaling deeply, stirring, slowly ripple through life in ways that feel invisible at first, but gradually shape the day, the mind, and the heart. It was the accumulation of these tiny mindful choices, day after day, that created a life infused with calm, clarity, and quiet joy. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? The light caught the steam just as it spiraled upward. This story is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. Linda lingered in her kitchen, mug in hand, letting the morning sunlight touch her face as she watched the steam from her coffee rise in delicate spirals. She had grown accustomed to these small rituals over the past months, and today she felt their subtle power more than ever. The powder she added each morning hadn't transformed her life overnight, nor had it promised any miraculous effects. Yet it had become a quiet invitation to pause, to notice, and to appreciate the ordinary moments that make up a day. Many people notice that as they age, life begins to demand more deliberate attention. Energy shifts, focus fluctuates, and patience isn't something that arrives automatically, it's cultivated. Linda had discovered that the tiniest habits, when performed consistently with intention, could shape her mood, her focus, and her awareness over time. The powder in her coffee was a simple anchor, a cue to slow down, observe, and engage fully with each moment. Her mind wandered to the week ahead, the tasks and obligations that often loomed large. Yet for the first time in a long while, they felt manageable, even gentle. She recognized that the steady presence she felt in these mornings, built from small rituals, rippled outward, influencing the rhythm of her day before it even began. Her body and mind were not magically energized, they were simply more attuned, more responsive to the cues she had cultivated. Linda's personal reflection deepened as she thought about the role of attention in shaping experience. She remembered her earlier years, rushing through mornings, multitasking, barely noticing the coffee's warmth or aroma. Life had been a series of checklists, each item demanding completion rather than attention. Now, she realized that noticing the way the steam danced, the faint aroma of the powder, the comforting weight of the mug, created an undercurrent of calm that shaped everything else. According to many studies, small, consistent, mindful routines can subtly influence energy, mood, and cognition over time. These effects are not immediate or guaranteed, but they accumulate, scaffolding well-being and awareness in ways that are both tangible and imperceptible. Linda appreciated this perspective because it reflected her lived experience, the power of small, repeated acts, performed with presence, to shape perception and rhythm throughout the day. She set the mug down briefly to check her planner. A short walk, a call to a friend, and a few household tasks awaited. Each one seemed lighter than usual, not because her body had transformed, but because she had trained her mind to notice and inhabit each moment fully. Even mundane acts, folding laundry, rinsing dishes, carrying groceries, carried an unexpected satisfaction when approached with gentle attention. As she walked to the mailbox later, Linda paid attention to the crisp air, the crunch of frost underfoot, the distant chatter of neighbors. Each detail was fleeting yet grounding, and she realized how much richness is lost when life is approached only as a series of tasks to complete. The powder in her coffee hadn't done the work for her, but it had served as a quiet signal. Pause, notice, savor. That signal, repeated over weeks, had reshaped her mornings and the way she moved through her days. Back in the kitchen, she returned to her mug, now empty, and inhaled the lingering aroma. It reminded her that change doesn't always arrive in dramatic moments. Often it whispers through accumulation, through small gestures, deliberate pauses, and attentive observation. Linda smiled, appreciating the quiet wisdom of these routines. She felt steady, calm, and present, ready to move through her day with awareness rather than rushing blindly. Later, as the afternoon light shifted across her living room, Linda reflected on the subtle ripples of change that small, consistent acts could create. A short stretch here, a mindful sip there, a pause to observe the world around her. Each gesture contributed to a richer, steadier sense of well-being. These were the real gifts of mindful routines. Not flashy or immediate, but quietly transformative, weaving presence and attention into the fabric of everyday life. By evening, she felt a deepened calm in her body, clarity in her mind, and warmth in her heart. The powder had not magically enhanced her energy or resolved challenges, it had simply served as a conduit for awareness. And through awareness, she discovered a subtle but profound shift. Days that once felt hurried or fragmented now held space for presence, patience, and quiet joy. Sometimes, she thought, the smallest gestures, the swirl of a spoon, the scent of coffee, the warmth held in hands, ripple through life in ways that feel imperceptible at first, yet shape perception, mood, and energy profoundly over time. It was not about dramatic fixes or guarantees, but about cultivating habits of presence, noticing, and gentle attention, day after day, moment after moment. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? She tapped the counter twice before taking a sip. This story is meant to inform, and inspire, not to provide medical advice. Linda paused, letting the mug rest against her palms, feeling the warmth seep slowly through her fingers. The powder she had been adding to her coffee for weeks sat quietly dissolved in the rich brown liquid, unassuming, yet somehow significant. It wasn't a magic solution, nor did it promise instant energy or clarity, but it had become part of a morning ritual that shaped how she approached her day. Today, that ritual felt particularly grounding, as though the simple act of noticing, of paying attention, had begun to ripple outward in ways she could almost feel. She reflected on how much her mornings had changed over the past year. In her 40s and 50s, the routine had been a blur, rushing through breakfast, emails pinging in rapid succession, errands demanding completion. Energy had been unpredictable, focus fleeting, and calm had been a distant aspiration. Now, even these ordinary tasks carried weight when approached with intention. The powder wasn't the cause of change, it was the signal, the gentle prompt to pause, breathe, and notice the details that had once gone unnoticed. Many people notice that as they age, the small, repeated gestures of daily life hold more influence than dramatic interventions. Energy, mood, and focus often respond to cumulative, subtle habits rather than sudden, forceful changes. Linda's mornings had become a mosaic of such habits, cradling the mug, inhaling its aroma, stirring the powder thoughtfully. These small moments reminded her to pay attention, to anchor herself before stepping into the day. Her personal reflection deepened as she thought about the weeks behind her. Each sip of coffee had become a meditation in miniature, an opportunity to observe sensation, acknowledge presence, and notice subtle shifts in energy or focus. Even mundane acts like the gentle swirl of the liquid in her mug, or the rising steam catching the sunlight, were now imbued with meaning. She marveled at the quiet power of small, intentional actions repeated over time. According to many studies, consistent, mindful routines influence cognition, mood, and physical energy over time. The effects are subtle, not instantaneous or guaranteed, yet they accumulate, creating a scaffold for well-being. Linda had experienced this firsthand. It wasn't the powder itself, but the attention it invited, the deliberate pause it prompted, and the gentle awareness it nurtured, that shaped her mornings and colored her days with calm and presence. Stepping outside later, Linda felt the crisp winter air fill her lungs. Each footstep on the frost-covered sidewalk was deliberate, measured, and calming. She noticed the way sunlight reflected off icy branches, the distant laughter of children playing, the pattern of footprints left behind by neighbors. These small observations, she realized, were gifts made visible only through attentive presence. The ritual of coffee, the powder, the mindful pause, they had taught her to see the ordinary with new eyes. Back home, she prepared for her afternoon tasks. Even folding laundry or rinsing dishes carried a subtle grace when approached with awareness. The tiny gestures of daily life, once taken for granted, now became opportunities for reflection and engagement. Linda understood that energy, patience, and calm weren't summoned by chance. They were cultivated gently, consistently, through intention and attention. As evening approached, Linda returned to her kitchen, settling once again with a warm mug. The powder had dissolved completely, yet its quiet influence lingered. It reminded her that meaningful change doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Often, it whispers through small, consistent acts, each one building on the last, creating patterns that shape perception, mood, and experience in ways that are invisible but deeply felt. Her gaze drifted to the sunlight spilling across the counter. She thought about the past months, the steady accumulation of mindful mornings, of attentive gestures, of deliberate pauses. These small habits had reshaped not only her mornings, but her perspective, her patience, and her ability to notice the beauty in ordinary life. Life, she realized, was built from these subtle ripples, tiny actions, repeated with care, that quietly shifted everything over time. Linda smiled softly, feeling a deepened sense of calm and presence settle in her body and mind. She realized that the powder in her coffee had not been magical, but it had been a gentle teacher. It had shown her that awareness, attention, and small intentional acts hold a quiet, cumulative power to transform the way we experience life. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? The first sip lingered longer than usual, warm and familiar. This story is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. Linda sat at her kitchen table, cradling her mug, as morning sunlight streamed through the window, casting long, gentle shadows across the counter. The powder she added each day had become a ritual, a subtle cue to pause and observe. Today, she felt a deeper appreciation for that quiet moment. It wasn't about energy or quick fixes, it was about presence, about allowing herself to inhabit the morning fully before stepping into the demands of life. She reflected on how her relationship with mornings had changed over the past year. In her earlier decades, she had rushed through breakfast, emails, and errands without much thought, trying to stretch every minute. Energy ebbed unpredictably, focus wavered, and mornings often felt like a frantic race. But now, even these simple routines carried meaning. The powder, once just an addition to coffee, had become a signal, a gentle reminder that small intentional acts could anchor her day and shift her perception of time and energy. Many people notice that aging brings a need for more deliberate attention. Energy fluctuates, patience requires cultivation, and focus doesn't arrive automatically. Small, repeated gestures, pausing, noticing, savoring, gradually reshape daily experience. Linda had come to understand that these tiny rituals, though subtle, could have profound effects on mood, perception, and resilience over time. Her personal reflection deepened as she thought about the cumulative impact of these small rituals. Each sip of coffee, each swirl of the powder, each inhalation of aroma had trained her mind to notice. Even the mundane, the steam rising, the warmth in her palms, the faint hum of the refrigerator had become a lesson in presence. The simple act of paying attention had quietly reshaped how she experienced her days. Science offers some context for this intuition. Many studies suggest that consistent, mindful routines influence cognition, mood, and energy over time. These effects are subtle and gradual, not instant or guaranteed, but they accumulate to create a framework for well-being. Linda appreciated this perspective because it reflected her lived experience. The power of attention, the influence of small repeated actions, and the gentle reshaping of everyday life through consistent, mindful practice. Later that morning, she stepped outside for a walk. The winter air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and the crunch of frost underfoot. Each step felt deliberate, each breath grounding. She noticed the tiny details: a neighbor's cat slinking along a fence, sunlight reflecting on icy branches, the rhythm of her own heartbeat. These observations, though ordinary, became rich and meaningful because she had cultivated the habit of noticing. The powder, the ritual, and the mindful attention it encouraged had quietly expanded her capacity to see and feel the subtleties around her. Back home, she moved through her daily tasks with a newfound awareness. Folding laundry, rinsing dishes, arranging flowers, mundane acts were transformed by the attention she brought to them. She realized that energy, focus, and calm weren't things to be summoned from nowhere. They were cultivated gently through repeated, deliberate acts that honored both body and mind. The powder itself hadn't created change, but it had been a conduit, a prompt to practice presence consistently. As evening approached, Linda returned to the kitchen. She cradled her now empty mug and reflected on the quiet accumulation of rituals over time. Life's richness, she realized, was composed not of dramatic moments but of subtle, repeated gestures that shape perception, mood, and energy incrementally. She understood that mindful attention, gently cultivated, had become a form of empowerment. It allowed her to approach life with patience, presence, and appreciation, even in the face of ordinary challenges and routines. Sometimes, she thought, the smallest gestures, pausing before a sip, inhaling aroma deeply, noticing warmth or light ripple quietly through a day, gradually shifting perception, mood, and energy. Over weeks, months, and years, these ripples accumulate into something profoundly sustaining. A life experienced with awareness, calm, and subtle joy. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? The chair creaked as she settled in, mug in hand. This story is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. Linda sank into her favorite kitchen chair, cradling her mug with both hands. Steam rose in gentle spirals, curling into the morning light, carrying the faint aroma of coffee and the powder she had been adding each day for months. She didn't notice it for dramatic effects or instant energy boosts. She noticed it because it invited her to pause, to breathe, and to be fully present. This tiny ritual, repeated day after day, had quietly become an anchor, a subtle thread connecting the ordinary moments of her life. Reflecting on her mornings over the past year, Linda realized how much had shifted. Previously, she had rushed through the early hours, trying to cram in emails, breakfast, and household chores. Energy was unpredictable, focus fleeting, and calm often elusive. But now, even the simplest acts carried significance. Stirring the powder into her coffee, inhaling its aroma, feeling the warmth of the mug, each was a deliberate, mindful gesture, shaping her mindset and the rhythm of her day. Many people notice that as life progresses, energy, focus, and patience are no longer automatic. They require cultivation. Small, consistent routines, tiny habits that invite attention and presence can have cumulative effects on mood, clarity, and overall well-being. Linda's mornings, once a blur of tasks, had become a quiet landscape of rituals that nurtured her body and mind. The powder was not a miracle. It was a gentle prompt to inhabit the present moment fully. Her personal reflection deepened as she considered the subtle transformations she had observed. Each sip, each swirl, each mindful inhale created a ripple. Even when nothing appeared outwardly changed, she noticed that she approached challenges differently. Errands felt less taxing, conversations more engaging, and her attention more steady. The small rituals weren't about dramatic improvement, they were about shaping experience through gentle, repeated actions that built awareness, calm, and resilience over time. According to many studies, consistent, mindful routines influence cognition, mood, and energy levels gradually but meaningfully. The effects are not instantaneous or guaranteed, but their accumulation creates a scaffold for daily life. Linda had felt this firsthand. It wasn't the powder itself that created the shift. It was the attention, presence, and deliberate engagement it inspired day after day that reshaped her mornings and the way she experienced the rest of the day. Later, Linda went for her daily walk. The crisp winter air carried the scent of damp earth, the faint smell of wood smoke drifting from chimneys. Each step on the frost-covered sidewalk felt deliberate and grounding. She noticed the subtle patterns, sunlight glinting off icy branches, the soft rustle of leaves caught in a breeze, footprints left behind by early risers. These ordinary details, she realized, became extraordinary when observed with intention. The powder, the ritual, and the mindful pause it encouraged had expanded her awareness, turning routine moments into quiet celebrations of presence. Returning home, she moved through household tasks with a gentle attentiveness, folding laundry, rinsing dishes, arranging flowers on the table. Mundane chores became opportunities for engagement, reflection, and calm. Energy and focus, Linda realized, were not conjured by magic. They were cultivated through repeated, deliberate acts. The powder in her coffee wasn't transformative in itself, but it had served as a conduit for mindful attention, a reminder that presence could be cultivated one small moment at a time. As evening approached, Linda returned to the kitchen to finish her cup. She inhaled the lingering aroma, noticing the comfort it brought, the rhythm it set, and the subtle shift it inspired in her awareness. Life's richness, she thought, is composed not of sudden, dramatic interventions, but of countless small acts repeated with intention. Each moment observed, each gesture attended to, each pause embraced, accumulates quietly to shape the texture of our days. Sometimes, she reflected, the smallest gestures, pausing before a sip, inhaling aroma fully, noticing warmth or light ripple outward, subtly altering perception, mood, and energy. Over time, these ripples weave together to create a life that feels steady, aware, and quietly joyful, even amidst ordinary routines and responsibilities. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? Chapter 20. Daihon. The sun spilled gold across the countertop, warming her mug. This story is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. Linda sat quietly in her kitchen, cradling her mug with both hands. The powder had long since dissolved into the rich brown liquid, leaving behind a simple warmth and aroma that seemed to anchor her in the moment. Over the past year, this small daily ritual had quietly become a lens through which she experienced life, inviting her to notice, to pause, and to inhabit her mornings fully. It wasn't about energy surges or miraculous effects. It was about presence, awareness, and the accumulation of small, intentional acts. She reflected on how much had shifted since she first began adding the powder to her coffee. Mornings that once felt rushed and chaotic had transformed into moments of calm, small rituals shaping the rhythm of her day. She remembered the frantic year's emails pinging endlessly, breakfast grabbed hastily, errands swallowed in a blur. Now, even the simplest acts carried meaning. Stirring the powder, inhaling the aroma, cradling the warmth in her hands, all small gestures that invited mindfulness. Many people notice that, as life progresses, patience, energy, and focus require deliberate cultivation. Subtle, repeated habits can influence mood, cognition, and well-being over time. Linda had discovered that these small, consistent rituals could shift perception and experience in ways that were both tangible and quietly profound. The powder itself did nothing miraculous. It was the attention it prompted, the pause it inspired, and the awareness it nurtured that created the shift. Her personal reflection deepened as she thought about the accumulation of these moments. Each sip, each swirl, each inhale of the coffee's aroma had become a thread in the fabric of her daily life. Even mundane acts, watching steam curl, feeling warmth in her hands, listening to distant sounds, were imbued with significance because she had trained herself to notice. The quiet repetition of these acts had reshaped her approach to the world, creating a steadier, calmer, more engaged presence. According to many studies, small, consistent routines can influence mood, energy, and cognition over time. The effects are subtle, cumulative, and often imperceptible at first, but they build a scaffold for resilience, calm, and clarity. Linda experienced this firsthand. The change wasn't dramatic or instantaneous, but over months, the gentle practice of mindful mornings had shifted how she felt, how she moved through her day, and how she observed the ordinary moments of life. She stepped outside later, feeling the crisp air on her cheeks, the crunch of frost underfoot, and the soft warmth of the sunlight on her shoulders. Each step felt grounded, deliberate, and full of awareness. She noticed neighbors tending gardens, birds flitting across bare branches, and the distant hum of early morning traffic. These small observations, she realized, had become rich with meaning because of the attention she had cultivated through her morning ritual. Back inside, she moved through her afternoon with the same gentle attentiveness. Folding laundry, rinsing dishes, making tea, mundane tasks became opportunities for reflection, presence, and gratitude. Energy, focus, and calm were not summoned by magic. They were cultivated through repeated, deliberate acts of attention. The powder in her coffee had not transformed her life on its own, but it had been the conduit, the quiet teacher reminding her to inhabit each moment fully. As evening settled in, Linda returned to her kitchen once more, mug in hand. The powder's aroma lingered faintly, a reminder of months of mindful practice. She felt the warmth of the mug, the rhythm of her breath, and the steady pulse of her awareness. Life's richness, she realized, does not emerge from dramatic events, miraculous interventions, or instant transformations. It emerges from countless small, intentional acts, repeated with presence and care, accumulating quietly to shape perception, mood, and energy. She reflected on the subtle but profound ripples these small actions had created: the calm mornings, the steady focus, the gentle resilience, the heightened appreciation for ordinary beauty. These ripples had carried into conversations, walks, household tasks, and moments of reflection. They had quietly shifted how she engaged with life, giving her a sense of agency, mindfulness, and joy that had previously felt elusive. Sometimes, Linda thought, the smallest gestures, pausing before a sip, inhaling aroma deeply, noticing warmth, feeling sunlight ripple through life in ways that feel invisible at first, yet gradually reshape perception, mood, and energy. Over weeks and months, these ripples accumulate into a steady current, a quiet momentum that transforms ordinary days into a life rich with presence, patience, and subtle joy. She set her empty mug down, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a day well begun, a ritual faithfully observed, and attention deliberately cultivated. Linda understood now that life's shifts often do not come in grand gestures. They come in the cumulative power of small, consistent, mindful actions, each one shaping the next. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything?